There are a couple of weird stories my family insists are true. One similar to OP's is that my great uncle was a witch who could turn into a crow. A more interesting one is that one night when my grandfather was a teenager he was riding home from town. This is rural New Mexico, and his family owned a ranch, so this was normal. Anyway, as he was riding he heard a baby crying. He got off his horse and started searching for it. A little of the trail, in some brush, he found a baby. Worried, he took the baby and headed home. It would be taken care of. As he was riding he started hearing what sounded like a grown man laughing. He looked down and realized it was the baby. It looked at him and smiled, revealing a mouth of full-grown teeth. Screaming, he threw the baby aside and galloped his horse home. There are no fish in Mirror Lake. They all died and washed up on its shores. The people in town won't believe me, but I saw them flood the beach. Their bodies were rounded up and eaten by the creatures in the woods. The few bones that were left were buried in the sand, but no one will come see them. The fishermen lost interest in the lake long ago. No one comes to Mirror Lake anymore except for us lonely few who live on its edge. The others that live on its shore say that the fish are still alive. But I know the truth. There are no fish in Mirror Lake. There is no life in Mirror Lake. Every ounce of living flesh tried to escape, the fish and the toads, the bottom dwellers, and the reptilian. Everything that once tried to survive in Mirror Lake has failed. Now all that stays is the cold dead plants and the rotting bodies of the deceased. If you speak to the others around the lake, they will tell you that the lake is filled with life. They say that the fish and toads are all around, that the bottom dwellers and reptilians are only hiding. But I know the truth. There is no life in Mirror Lake. There are no waves on Mirror Lake. Its water stays still through violent wind and pouring rain. A pebble can stir no ripples on its surface. A boulder would only sink calmly into its murky depths. The people believe that its surface moves, the others on its edge say it moves as much as ever. But I have watched the water, and I know the truth. There are no waves on Mirror Lake. There are no reflections on Mirror Lake. There is only the opaque pitch on its surface. Your image will not show on Mirror Lake if you look from above. The many trees and few houses are not displayed on its still water. The people in the town do not dare look at the murky water in Mirror Lake, and the others that live on its edge say that they see the reflections on its surface fine. But I have stared into Mirror Lake for hours, and I know the truth. There are no reflections on Mirror Lake. Mirror Lake is dead. Its water is deep and unmoving. Its life has all dried up. There is nothing left in Mirror Lake, but I still do not dare look out my window at it at night, for I might see something that stirs its water. I do not wish to see the thing that moves in Mirror Lake, because I know there are no fish in Mirror Lake. The first few nights, I woke up in a cold sweat, unsure of what plagued my dreams. I remembered only the impression of something restraining me. After a week, the dim light from the city would illuminate my room just enough for me to make out a dissipating cloud. It seemed as if something would puff out of existence the second I woke up. The cold sweat persisted. During that same time I developed problems with my ankles. Simply walking would make the joint feel stretched, like I'd spent all night standing tiptoe. My doctor gave me a muscle relaxant, thinking it was a muscle spasm. They didn't seem to do the trick and the tension only got worse. The nightmares continued. Every night I would spring out of sleep, suddenly awake, and the cloud soon only formed at the foot of my bed. It took longer to dissipate in the third week, the nebulous form of something hunched over slowly leaking out of focus. The image also transitioned over that week from a shadow to a white sort of steam. The pain in my ankles began to intensify in those final weeks. When I could get to the doctor he couldn't identify any real problem. It just seemed that I slept with my feet tensed. I even underwent a lab test, but for once I didn't experience the nightmare or the waking visions. The doctor sent me home with more medicine and recommended rest for a few days. At home I took the medications and slipped off into sleep, hopeful that the condition had finally ended. I suppose the medications kept me sleeping longer than usual because I awoke to a hoarse braying and intense pressure on my lower legs. My eyes sprung open and I sat bolt upright as I came face to face with the pale, hairless thing which hunched at the bottom of my bed, sitting on my feet and watching me with its head cocked curiously. As I opened my mouth to scream, it slowly began to waver and dissipate into the morning gloom. Slowly. Okay, this is an old dream but I'll try to recall it as well as I can. I had this one a couple of summers back. Anyone know what it means? It started with me just walking out of my house and a kid from my school at the time running at me, murderously. So I ran to the side of the house and climbed to the roof. On top of it, there stood this girl from that school, who IRL was the sweetest person you could ever know, who started a fist fight. I could not hit her. 1. I would never hit a woman. 2. My arms were temporarily paralyzed for some reason. So, being unable to defend myself, I was thrown off the roof and landed headfirst into the cement. Blood was coming out, but I was not dead, nor unconscious. The dream wouldn't let me wake up. Fast forward to me running from those two, down my street. There were no cars and no other people. After going down a few blocks, I found myself in a portion of a theme park a few hours away. I was standing on a wooden bridge, hanging over the water. Suddenly, all of my friends from the school were closing in on me, zombie-like. I was cornered. Then, another girl came out of the crowd, and ran at me. She pushed me over the wooden barrier and off the bridge. I landed, back first, onto a big rock in the middle of the water, and more blood came out. Somehow, I was still alive and floating and was drifting back towards land. Once I hit land, I looked up to see my friends all crowding around me, like you see in all those horror movies, while I remained on the ground. They all reached out for me and I woke up with a bad headache and a bad back. Remember that I had this dream years ago during the summer right before freshman year of high school, so these were middle school friends. The bridge and the water from the part of the park in the story, but the ship wasn't there from what I remember in the dream. Thought/X? This one seems like an alien story at first, but it isn't your standard UFO encounter. Location, near Cao Bang, North Vietnam, at the time, date, August 12 to 13, 1968. A group of Soviet engineers were working in this region hoping to build a hydroelectric power plant, when they heard a rumbling of engines overhead. They all ran out of their tents and were surprised to see a black, diamond-shaped object hovering in the sky, emitting a greenish-blue light. Moments later, the diamond-shaped object was struck by a fiery object that seemed to come from out of the earth. There was a bright flash, followed by a powerful shockwave that knocked the Russians down, tore their tents apart, and swept away their equipment. Somehow, no one was seriously hurt, but the explosion deeply troubled everyone. For several hours, all the radio and communication equipment was down, and they had to wait until morning to report the incident to their superiors. They promised to prepare a full report on the incident. 2 days later, the scientists found a black sphere-shaped object, about 3 meters in diameter, a short distance from camp. The surface of the sphere was completely black, and reflected no light. Even stranger, the sphere did not cast a shadow. The rays of the sun seemed to go around and right through the object, falling on the high grass all around it. The scientists also noticed that the sphere was cool and slippery, as if doused with soapy water. One of the men attempted to scratch the surface of the sphere with a sharp knife to no avail. They notified their superiors about their strange finding, and soon afterwards, the group received instructions to set up a protective perimeter around the object and to guard it until a special group arrived. They were strictly warned not to get within 20 meters of the sphere, so the entire group, 5 men total, camped exactly 20 meters away from the sphere. They had no idea what the sphere could be and guessed it was some kind of new weaponry. After building a small bonfire, the men sat down to rest. One of the specialists, Boris Lvanov, wrote in his diary that the men rested uneasy, staring at the object with their carbines ready, just in case, as they waited for the Special Forces group to eventually show up and take control of the situation. Soon one of the men, Vyacheslav, stood up and walked into the brushwood, which was in the direction of the sphere. The rest barely noticed, thinking he was just walking off to relieve himself. When he didn't return, the men began to nervously call out his name, but there was no response. They searched the area with flashlights but could not find Vyacheslav. Concerned and afraid, the rest of the men eventually gave up and returned to the bonfire. An hour later, another man named Peter silently rose and also walked into the brushwood, in exactly the same direction that Vyacheslav had taken. He seemed to move uncomfortably, rocking back and forth, as if very drowsy. A kind of anxiety suddenly enveloped the rest of the men and they remained sitting by the bonfire, unable or unwilling to intervene. Peter never returned. This time the remaining men did not search for Peter, but simply sat and waited. A feeling of doom filled the men. 2 hours later, Vladimir walked off in the direction of the sphere. It was obvious that he had no control. It was as if something were forcing him away from the bonfire. He also never came back. Now only 2 men remained, Boris and Sergei. Both were frozen with fear, refusing to move in the slightest from their positions. Suddenly, Sergei's face became distorted. He stood up like a marionette and meandered away into the dark, in the direction of the strange sphere. Moments later, Boris began to feel his body losing its terrified stiffness and beginning to move. Terrified, he grabbed his carbine and shot himself on the leg so that he wouldn't walk away to an uncertain fate. As a result of the pain, he passed out. This action possibly saved Boris. He woke up in the morning when the specialists arrived. They found him half-conscious by the now extinguished fire. He had lost a lot of blood but was still alive. However, the sphere had disappeared along with his comrades. He was soon thereafter evacuated from the area. But the event left him convinced that the sphere had been responsible for the disappearance of his friends. In 1996 I started law school at a big state school in the southern US. Think SEC football. Other than studying, I spent most of my time playing multi-user dungeons over the internet until my school's IT dude cut me off saying I was wasting resources. That was fine with me. For $20 a month I could buy unlimited dial-up from some independent ISP and mud all I wanted. Things were fine until I started getting a lot of dropped connections. Like every 20 minutes my landline would disconnect. I lived in an apartment complex off campus. It was probably 50 to 50 grad students and local rednecks. I called South Central Bell. And they sent a guy out to check my line. He fixed the problem. My phone line had been tapped. Someone in this town where I have never lived and knew no one had tapped my phone to listen to my conversations. Whenever they tried while I was on the internet, it caused enough interference to drop the connection. It bugged the shit out of me, but what could I really do about it? I just put it behind me. Then I left town for the summer and had my mail held at the post office until I came back for year 2. I got back in August, picked up my mail, and had them resume normal mail service to my address. 2 months later I stopped receiving mail completely. It didn't register with me until they cut off my electricity for failure to pay a bill I never received. The lady at the post office said someone had forwarded my mail but wouldn't tell me who or to where. It still puzzles me what the fuck was going on there.